The house on Marrow Lane had been a simple thing once. Clapboard and stone, a shallow porch, windows framed in peeling white. Over the years it had absorbed the character of its inhabitants. Chipped paint, a sagging gutter, the spidery cracks that crept up the foyer walls. No one in the neighborhood remembered it ever being new. In fact, no one remembered much about the place at all, except that it had stood there, hunched and sullen, since before any of them were born. When the Boyds bought it in late October, the leaves had barely started to change. Molly was 7 months pregnant and heavy with twins, and she and her husband Greg had spent the past year hunting for a home with character. Something old but sturdy, a place that could be mended and made their own. The listing for the house on Marrow Lane had mentioned a unique bonus room, which Molly, ever the optimist, imagined as a sunroom or a den. Instead, what they found was a windowless, wedge-shaped space at the back of the second floor, lined from floor to ceiling with ancient, tarnished mirrors. Some kind of dressing room, maybe? Greg had said, peering in with his hands on his hips. Molly pressed a palm to her belly, feeling the twins shift and squabble within. Or a trophy room for a narcissist. She tried to joke, but the room unsettled her. The mirrors were old, older than the house maybe, with warped glass and ornate frames that curled like claws. Some of them were so clouded she could barely make out her own reflection, but she could see enough to notice the way the room seemed to tilt, the floor sloping imperceptibly toward a dark circular stain at the center of the faded carpet. It was as if the room had a drain and the whole house was funneling down into it. "I hate it," she told Greg that night after they'd made love on a mattress on the bare living room floor. "Let's rip them all out." He kissed her shoulder. "I'll do it tomorrow." But tomorrow came, and the next day, and the next, and the mirrors stayed. Greg worked long hours at the university, and Molly, on maternity leave and prone to exhaustion, found herself spending most of her days alone in the house. She unpacked boxes, organized the kitchen, and painted the nursery a cheerful yellow. She tried not to look at the door to the mirror room as she passed it on the way to the master bedroom, but sometimes in the dead hush of afternoon, she'd catch a glimpse of herself in one of the mirrors, a pale, swollen woman with haunted eyes watching her from the shadows. She started having dreams. In them, she wandered the house at night, barefoot and silent, and the rooms shifted behind her as she walked, doors opening onto unfamiliar halls, windows that looked out on impossible landscapes. Sometimes she'd find herself standing in the mirror room, the twins inside her belly thrashing like trapped fish, while her reflection smiled and smiled and smiled. The first time it happened, Molly woke with the taste of blood in her mouth. She sat up, heart jackhammering, and ran her tongue over her teeth, half expecting to find them broken or loose. But everything was in place, except for the ache at the base of her skull and the metallic tang that lingered long after she rinsed her mouth with water. She didn't tell Greg. He had enough on his mind, and she didn't want to be the kind of wife who needed constant reassurance. Instead, she focused on the practical, walking every day, eating well, preparing for the twins. She made lists and checked them twice. She ignored the way the mirrors seemed to multiply in her peripheral vision, the way her reflection lagged behind her movements, just for a heartbeat. One afternoon, as she was sorting laundry in the hallway, she heard a sound from the mirror room. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming on glass. She froze, hands buried in a mound of Greg's shirts, and waited for it to stop. It didn't. If anything, it grew louder, more insistent. She crept to the door and pressed her ear to the wood. The tapping was definitely coming from inside, sharp and precise. She hesitated, then turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was empty. The mirrors glimmered in the half-light, their surfaces mottled with age. Molly stepped inside, shivering as the air seemed to drop 10 degrees. She walked to the center of the room, to the dark stain in the carpet, and looked at her reflection in the largest mirror. For a moment, she thought she saw movement behind her, a blur of red, a flicker of teeth, but when she spun around, there was nothing. She backed out of the room and shut the door, hard. The tapping stopped. That night, Molly dreamed of giving birth. In the dream, she lay on her back in a hospital bed, legs splayed, while Greg and a faceless doctor stood at her feet. She pushed and pushed, sweat pouring down her face, but the babies wouldn't come. Instead, she felt something cold and slick wriggle up her throat, choking her. She tried to scream, but her mouth filled with blood, and when she looked down, she saw that her belly was flat, empty, and her reflection in the overhead light fixture was grinning with a mouthful of razor-sharp teeth. She woke up, gasping, clutching her belly. The twins were quiet, but she could feel them, heavy and inert. She lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, until she heard Greg's alarm go off in the next room. The days blurred together. Molly stopped leaving the house. She started seeing things in the mirrors, flickers of movement, shapes that didn't belong. Sometimes she'd catch sight of herself, but the reflection would be wrong. The tilt of her head, the set of her jaw, the way her eyes lingered a fraction too long before blinking. She tried to avoid the mirror room, but it seemed to call to her, a magnetic pull that grew stronger with each passing day. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange, Molly sat on the edge of the bathtub staring at her reflection in the medicine cabinet. Her skin was pale and waxy, her eyes rimmed with purple. She reached up to touch her face, and her reflection did the same. But there was a split second, a tiny, almost imperceptible delay before the movement was mirrored. She leaned closer. "What do you want?" she whispered. The reflection smiled, not a big smile, just a small, knowing curl of the lips. Molly slammed the cabinet shut. She stood up, dizzy, and stumbled down the hall to the nursery. The yellow walls seemed jaundiced in the dim light, the crib looming like a cage. She sat in the rocking chair and cradled her belly, humming a lullaby her mother used to sing. She tried to think of the future, the twins, their first steps, the three of them together in the sunlit backyard. But the images wouldn't come. All she could see was the mirror room, and her own face grinning back at her. She must have dozed off, because the next thing she knew, Greg was shaking her awake. His face was tight with worry. "Molly? Honey, you okay?" She blinked at him. "What time is it?" "Almost midnight. I just got home. You didn't answer your phone." She looked down. Her phone was on the floor, screen shattered. "I dropped it," she mumbled. "Sorry." Greg knelt beside her, hands gentle on her knees. "You've got to take care of yourself. And the babies. You can't just..." "I know." She pulled away from him, stood up, and crossed to the window. The street was empty, the houses across the way dark and silent. "I just need to sleep." He nodded, clearly unconvinced. "Let's go to bed." They lay together in the dark, Greg's arms draped over her, his breath warm against her neck. Molly stared at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the plaster, until she finally drifted off. In the morning, she woke to a cold, prickling sensation on the back of her neck. She sat up, heart pounding, and looked around. Greg was gone, already at work, probably. She rolled out of bed and shuffled to the bathroom. Her face in the mirror looked even worse than before. Eyes sunken, lips cracked and dry. She splashed water on her cheeks, but it didn't help. She wandered the house in a daze, unable to focus on anything. The mirror room loomed at the end of the hall, the door ajar. She felt a compulsion, strong and sudden, to go inside. She tried to resist, but her feet moved of their own accord, carrying her down the hall and into the cold, reflective chamber. The mirrors greeted her with 100 distorted versions of herself, all staring, all waiting. She walked to the center of the room and turned slowly, watching the reflections ripple and shudder. Her breath fogged the glass, but the images remained clear. She reached out and touched the surface of the nearest mirror. It was ice cold, slick with condensation. Her fingers left smears on the glass, but the reflection didn't match. Her hand in the mirror lingered, pressed flat against the surface, while her real hand dropped to her side. "Stop it," she whispered. The reflection smiled again, wider this time. Molly stumbled back, heart hammering, and the room seemed to tilt around her. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of rot and old perfume. She tried to leave, but her legs buckled and she collapsed onto the stained carpet. The mirrors flickered, the reflections twisted, mouths opening in silent screams. Molly tried to crawl to the door, but something held her in place, a force like invisible hands pressing her down. She felt a pressure in her belly, sharp and hot. And then she was screaming, the sound bouncing off the glass and coming back to her 100-fold. She blacked out. When she came to, she was lying on her back, staring up at the ceiling. The room was silent, the mirrors calm. Molly sat up, dizzy and disoriented. Her belly ached, but the twins were still, silent as stones. She struggled to her feet and staggered out of the room, down the hall, and into the bathroom. She vomited into the sink bile and blood, and when she looked up, her reflection grinned at her, eyes black and bottomless. She screamed again, but this time, no sound came out. The days that followed were a blur. Greg tried to help. He took time off work, made her food, sat with her in the evenings, but Molly barely registered his presence. The house felt alive, pulsing with a dark, insistent energy. The mirrors multiplied, spreading from the bonus room into the halls, the bathrooms, the master bedroom. Molly covered them with towels and sheets, but the reflections bled through, shimmering on every surface. She stopped eating. The twins grew restless, kicking and rolling beneath her skin. Sometimes in the dead of night, she'd see tiny handprints pressed against the inside of her belly, stretching the skin until it bruised. She tried to call her mother, her doctor, anyone, but the phone lines were always dead, the screens filled with static. One night, Greg woke to find Molly standing at the foot of the bed, eyes wide and unblinking. He called her name, but she didn't respond. She just stood there, swaying slightly, her nightgown stained with blood. He rushed to her, tried to shake her awake, but her body was rigid, her skin cold as ice. He called 911. The ambulance came, the paramedics loaded her onto a stretcher, and Greg followed them to the hospital, hands shaking on the steering wheel. In the emergency room, the doctors rushed Molly into surgery. The twins were in distress, their heartbeats erratic. Greg paced the waiting room for hours, gnawing his knuckles raw, until a nurse finally appeared and led him to the NICU. The twins survived. Two tiny girls hooked up to machines, their chests rising and falling in perfect synchrony. Greg wept with relief. He asked about Molly, but the nurse's face darkened. "She's resting," was all she said. Greg found her in a private room, lying motionless beneath a thin hospital sheet. Her eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, her lips parted in a silent scream. The doctors called it postpartum psychosis, but Greg knew better. He saw it in her eyes, the reflection waiting just beneath the surface, biding its time. He took the twins home, hired a nurse to help. The house on Marrow Lane seemed different now, quieter, emptier. Greg avoided the mirror room, kept the door locked at all times. But sometimes, late at night, he'd hear a faint tapping from behind the door, like fingernails drumming on glass. And in the morning, he'd find the twins staring at their reflection in the window, eyes wide and unblinking, their mouths curled into the smallest of smiles.